important thing we need to think about or do next or happen next? It's a big question. Anybody?
I can go. In terms of that, having worked in the system, especially with juveniles for about 3 years or so, I would probably say, really conferences like this, institutes like some of the panelists here are part of, I would say grassroots kind of involving the community, involving stakeholders, getting people involved, getting the viewpoints of how we need to stop incarcerating these youth. A lot of, because working in the system, there have been a lot of improvements in terms of how the criminal justice system views youth. There's been, over the past decade or so, a lot of U.S. Supreme Court cases that have really changed the landscape of juvenile delinquency law across the nation. But and those have recognized, a lot of science, a lot of research, particularly the fact that juvenile brains, they're still developing up until the age 25, and we need to treat them differently. So there's been a lot of these cases that have, no death penalty, no life without parole. So great changes that have come about recently, but the work is so much further out from, or there's so much gap between how these courts have recognized that and how that's actually being practiced. And while I can say that California probably has a lot more progress than most of the states, when you actually go into the courts, when you actually see how the these cases are being prosecuted, the judges, the DAs, probation officers even, and I would even say some public defenders, defense attorneys in general, everyone that are involved in the system, I think still doesn't quite understand, still doesn't quite get that perspective. A lot of judges are still incarcerating at rates that I would say are too high, way too high. And it's come a long way, because back in the day, almost all these kids, any little crime comes in, they would go in and it would just be a norm. And that's certainly has changed, so there's progress. But I think really coming to that point, the most important thing is having people, the viewpoints change, talking to politicians, getting your word out, getting that voice out, starting these organizations that really change the landscape for these people. Because at the end of the day, these judges, you can try to throw all this, even laws that have trying to get them to change their perspective, but until the mindset of the community, the mindset of the state and the whole nation changes in terms of incarceration, I think that's kind of where we need to be. It's going to be a long way to go, but I think it starts with places like this and people like these up here, and you guys.
Actually, can I just, before you get into it, Ife, I want to introduce Leandra Kennard, who's just joined us, and she is a parent and community member, and we welcome her here to help join the conversation about juvenile justice. And I'm going to just allow her to introduce herself in a minute, give her a second, and so we'll pass it over to Ife first.
If I may, I'd like to start off by saying that I come into the work with an abolitionist framework. And so when we speak of the issue of mass incarceration, I'm more so rooted in a question of incarceration in general. And I think when you position the conversation in that way, the question become more about humanity. Why are we okay with incapacitating people in the forms in which we do, understanding that they have contexts, understanding that they come from specific spaces, are either undercut or don't have access to certain type of resources. And so for me, I feel like I find hope in areas not only written with education, but also like academy, in places that are looking to create like transformational change within someone. And when I say change, not to suggest that people are doing stuff, in my opinion, that are reflective of like bad or good, but more so giving them different tools to be able to navigate through the construct of our society as it stands right now. And so for me, the issue of juvenile justice and mass incarceration should be thought about the way issue of humanity. And I think if we focus on it through that lens, then we can begin to be okay and comfortable with initiatives that allows for people to seek justice in ways that are alternative to bars.
Leandra, I just want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell folks your relationship to the space of juvenile justice.
Okay, my name is Leandra Kennard, and I'm here today because my son is a product of the juvenile justice system as we speak today. And so that's one of the biggest reasons why I'm here, is to be an advocate for him and other children that are going through, you know, the mass incarceration today.
So in terms of juvenile justice, that's something that's been ongoing for quite a while, right? And it's been a long conversation. But I think that one of our hardest struggles is that the system has been bent on retribution for like the past 30 years. Right? And so just undoing that harm that's been created, undoing that system that's been institutionalized in how we treat just people in general, like the brother was saying, you know, it's an issue of humanity. Right? And so that's some of the obstacles that we see. But building on what Dean was talking about on a national landscape, just a couple of days ago, I met with some youth organizers that came from Tennessee. And that was one of our discussions. It was just about juvenile issues, like how are juveniles being treated. And so their system in Tennessee is not recognizing it for the most part. They're like not even as progressive, don't even have as much as we have here. And so unfortunately, you know, to some extent, they're going to have to use forms of judicial legislation. So basically what we're saying is challenging laws in the courts to force the legislators to make these laws to fit these other laws, you know, to conform to what our understanding of the Constitution is today. But, you know, it's a difficult uphill battle. And one of the challenges that I've faced in just trying to make a change is to gather the stories of the people that have gone through the system. It's just gathering them and like sharing them with the people that can make these choices, make these decisions. It's just so hard to find people willing to come out. And so that's some of our difficulties, right? Because there's always this narrative of good and bad. And they really just see bad, they don't see young, they don't see much else. And that's some of the difficulties we face. But to make things happen nationally, you know, I think the whole country just has to come together and just rise. Right? Everybody just has to come to some type of action, whether it's calling somebody, whether it's writing a letter, or just trying to start some initiative, try to push the community to say, hey, man, we need to change these particular laws. You know, in Tennessee, the advice I gave to them was, you know, you're going to have to use, you know, the cases that Dean was talking about. There's a series of cases, Roper, Graham, and Miller, and now recently Montgomery, and all these other, you know, there's a lot of work behind that. And so try to use that to make a mechanism, to make it work. You know, and that's some of the areas in juvenile justice has been able to work. It's based on those rulings. And that's what's given California, in my opinion, the ability to be so progressive, that they've seen these cases and they're willing to push. But in other parts of the state, not other parts of the state, but other parts of the country where it's more conservative, that's where our problems are at. You know, because they're not really looking at just people as humans, right? But in terms of what we've been able to do here in California, you know, just recently we had a number of bills passed, bills that we co-sponsored at YJC. So some of the stuff we got was AB 90, which is a gang database. So we've been working on to get it more accurate, get some accuracy, get some transparency. What a lot of people don't understand is that there was some terrible data on these gang databases. You got like infants self-admitting as gang members. Like, how is that even possible? Right? And so we've been working on that, and that's some of the victories that we've had at YJC. So we also have something to end juvenile life without. That just recently got signed. We had another thing on ending juvenile billing. For juveniles that go through the juvenile justice system, they're being told to pay money, right? And that basically gets passed off to the families. And so we've gotten that through. So that's another one of our successes. As a youth offender, you know, we've been able to get it expanded to people up to the age of 25. And so that's how I came home. Because when I was sentenced 23 years, 8 months when I was 17 years old. And so my original release date was in about 2019, 2022. And in 2014, because of SB 260 that came through, I got a shot at board, like never even had a chance. And then suddenly I got this shot at board. And that's kind of what the people in Tennessee were asking me about. How do we get that mechanism? Because they don't have it. Their mechanism starts at 60 years in. How is that even fair for a juvenile? You know, how does that make it a meaningful opportunity? You know, because there are these kids that are sentenced to life, but then there are kids just like out here that are sentenced to 100 plus years, 200, 300 years. That's like, you're never going to see that date, even though you don't have a life sentence. It's virtually life, because you're not going to be able to live 3 centuries. You're not going to die and come back 5 times, right? It just doesn't happen. We also won another victory that we pushed hard on, was getting Miranda rights for kids under 16. That was something else that we got improvements on. So YJC was a big part of that. And in terms of gun enhancements, you know, there was a lot of controversy in the past about the 10-20 life law and all that, and they made things mandatory. And so for me in particular, I had 7 years. I had 3 counts of robbery with use of a firearm. It happened shortly after my dad had died. I was 16. I wound up in the streets. I didn't have any resources to go to. I didn't have community, nobody. I was parentless. I was just out in the streets. But the way that the laws worked was once I got sentenced, they became mandatory. So for the robbery, I got 7 years. And I got 16 years and 8 months just because there was a gun involved. And so we've been able to restore that power to the judges. So now it becomes discretionary. And those are some of just our very recent victories. And so our landscape in California, you know, we are thankful that we can move forward, but there are a lot of other parts in the country that unfortunately are not. And the big thing that's missing from this conversation is what happens to juveniles when they come out and get stuck in deportation like me. And that is a very big problem. I've seen so many of us. And the problem that I've seen is that a lot of us don't get a chance to come out here, don't make it out here. So their stories are just straight lost. Their stories traveled with them overseas. Their stories went with them down to El Salvador. Their stories went down to, you know, Timbuktu, God knows where, because people are getting sent everywhere. But for me, I was only able to really be at this table because of spending time in the system and educating myself. When I became literate in legalese and learning how to understand law and just learning all that work. And so when it comes to juvenile justice, there's a lot of education that goes behind it. And there's a lot more involved in just nurturing the child, because it is a child, right? We have to be able to nurture them. So a lot of that work, just as community people, we need to just stand up and we just need to push. We need to make a scene out of it, because only the scenes get attention. If we just continue to sit in silence, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to remain status quo. And then at some point, it's going to start going backwards. Because right now we have some momentum in California. And so we have to just be loud and proud, and we just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to keep that thing going forward. And eventually it'll give us a little bit more of a crack.
So I just had put together like a few ideas that we've been trying to work on at YJC about how to build a real movement, what's really going to be necessary to challenge juvenile and criminal injustice and bring it down. And we don't have a lot of time, but I'm just going to try to go through it quickly. But the one thing I wanted to just challenge is that other states are different than ours. The reason other states are bad is because these policies have come out of LA County first, then spread to California, and then spread to the rest of the nation, and now spread to the rest of the world. So we have a particular place in this history that we have to take responsibility for. Even to this day, LA County still has the largest youth prison system in the world, the largest sheriff's department in the world, the largest probation department in the world. We feed into the largest prison system neck and neck with Texas. We're only 27% of the state's population, but make up 40% of the prison's population. So yes, California's gotten better. That's because of direct action organizing and a lot of push, especially from formerly incarcerated people in our families. It hasn't been that because California was more progressive. And in fact, we've led on the punishment industry. Secondly, what do we need to do as we move forward if we're really going to build a movement? Because our prison system went with all of this push, with all this work that everybody's done. It's gone from 171,000 at its peak down to about between 116 and 120,000 now. But if you look at where it was in 1980, it was only at about 26 to 30,000. So how can we get back to 1980 or even less? How can we really close youth prisons? And that's the state prison system that the youth prisons feed into. That doesn't include all the tens of thousands of people that are in jails, probation camps and ranches, and juvenile halls. So these are just, again, from our experiences, what I think we really should push if we want a strong movement. The first is to remember every youth. Obviously, every white youth that dies, that's incarcerated and thrown away from life, for life, or that disappears on the streets is remembered. They're at the front page of every news story. And even years later, people are still looking for them. But we have young people that disappear. Just Chuco's, our little community center, alone has now buried 79 people in about 8 years. And that doesn't include all the people we've buried in prison or all the people that have been deported. So we think that telling the stories of the young people that have been disappeared, that have been killed, that have been incarcerated for so long that they're dying in prison, that those stories have to be constantly told. The second is to know history. And for us, history has been really key to our own power as well as to our own understanding of the system. When we were going through the system, much like everybody else, you're made to feel ashamed, like something's different with you and your family. And the whole microscope is on you and your family, and if a little bit broader, on your community. And so history was really essential for us to say this is not about bad people or about crime. This is not even about public safety. This is about locking down primarily people of color, and then beyond that to poor people, and controlling the political landscape because of that. And so these same policies that were in place when it started are still in place. They just look different now. And so when we went through, and we can't go through it in detail, but we just saw all these trends in terms of how young people were seen over time. First as Satan, savages, and slaves, without even being seen as human, even if you were in a white, conservative Christian family. The first public school system in 1837 was called the Old Satan Deluder Act. Public schools set up to trick Satan out of the child. The second wave is young people being seen as cheap labor, and the majority of young people up until 1950s weren't even in school. They were in labor, whether poor white, immigrant youth, African Americans who either were forced through slavery or later on indentured servitude, or the kind of, I shouldn't have gone too far, the kind of forced agriculture that happened in the South, or Native youth who were stripped from their families and forced into boarding schools. And those boarding schools were mostly, again, working camps, only like less than half a day in school. The whole creation of Indian boarding schools is a part of our history. The creation of a dual system for African Americans where only a very few went to college and most went to trade schools. And the whole argument that happened between Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson was then repeated with Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington, right? The use of public schools first being created because young people that were coming during the immigration wave needed to have slightly better skills to fill factories, not because they wanted to fill colleges. And the classroom management doctrine that was put in place that we still have today, that schools haven't changed much from how they were set up in the 1600s. And then finally the 13th Amendment, which makes slavery legal for people that are deserving, quote unquote, of a punishment for their crime. And then we can go to what really came out in California, the backlash against youth power, and this is where you see the modern addiction to incarceration really comes out of LA County. First with the backlash against the 60s and 70s movements, and then with us exporting to the rest of the world, Richard Nixon and his war on drugs, Ronald Reagan, a war on drugs on steroids, as well as Iran-Contra, the deglobalization, taking union jobs out of communities and replacing it with a drug economy, and Howard Jarvis and the anti-tax movement that led to the passing of Prop 13 and a wave of anti-people of color sentiment from white people across the country. All of that comes out of LA, but we've never talked about LA as an epicenter for incarceration. And so the first tactics were to kill people that were counter to that in the 60s movements. That's George Jackson's funeral, to incarcerate people who spoke out. This is the killing of Ruben Salazar, the most outspoken Chicano writer at the time. And then most important, to flood communities of color. And it impacted white communities if we were living there, or white people that were living there, and had similar impacts on white rural communities. But primarily it was people of color that were flooded with a new economy. You extract union wage jobs and factory jobs, and you replace it with a drug economy. So LA County has too much to talk about, but until recently was also the epicenter for gun manufacturing. And then by the 1980s, you see the label of young people as super predators. And all of these policies come out of LA County. Too many to name, but including militarized policing, 3 strikes, Prop 21, the nation's harshest juvenile justice law in its history, and also built upon horror stories from the Central Valley to exploit those. So 3 strikes was a combination of Central Valley residents and then the money from LA to make that happen. Also out of LA comes the school to jail track. Ronald Reagan appoints William Bennett as Secretary of Education. He takes the zero tolerance that Nixon created into schools. And all of a sudden our schools start to look and operate like prisons. This is a new phenomenon. We've had police in our schools In LA, only since the 70s. In most states, only since the early 2000s. This is something we can fight. And we've become so normalized to it that we think that police should be in schools, despite the fact that when you go all the way back to the 1700s, 98% of the school shootings have been white shooters, and 96% of the victims have been white victims. Yet who gets the razor wire, the police in schools, the drug-sniffing dogs, the random searches, but communities of color? And I'm probably running out of time, but I think it's very important that we build for a movement. When we look at our opposition, they're incredibly resourced and incredibly organized. When you look at us, most of the time we look a lot like the intake at LA County Jail, which means that we're back to back. We're involved in a lot of organizational gangbanging. We fight for crumbs. We don't look eye to eye. We don't really share resources. And on our best days, we might have, like this is a YJC rally around the jail expansion. I think we had 250, 300 people there. I think our best rally we've had, or march, has been maybe 1,000 people around police violence. That's nothing near what it means to do movement building in the rest of the world. And California and the nation here in the United States is not engaged in movement building. We might have moments of protest politics that seem really strong, but in terms of having clear demands and a long-term movement strategy, we don't have it. And the last thing I would say is that when you look at how we operate in the US, if this is what it takes to build a movement anywhere in the world, anywhere in history, you can, I mean, it's just pretty much a formula that always exists. But in the United States, with the professionalization, quote unquote, of organizing, one of the things that happened was giving people a lot of money after the 60s and 70s movements to start nonprofits, knowing that if you've got a lot of federal money coming in, it'll squash activism because you're not going to go up against the people that are giving you those contracts. And foundations similarly took all the money, all the resources out of organizing and instead focused on funding aspects of organizing led not by the people most impacted by an issue, but by professional advocates, quote unquote. So the professional advocates that used to be in the streets, coming out of the prisons, coming out of sharecropping, coming out of dysfunctional schools, have now been replaced by professional advocates, quote unquote, that have never had those experiences, never had that lived experience, and don't have, not only do they not have the same analysis, but they don't have the same intention about a radical vision, and so we get stuck with reforms instead of real change. And when you look at the funding, it used to be that you would fund the whole totality of a movement, and the movement was at the center where people were accountable to the movement. But now what we have is only the blue boxes funded, and they're not accountable to the movement. They're accountable to their boards and to foundations. If we don't change this, we'll never have the kind of mass movements again that we need in the United States. I think that's why we haven't had really effective mass movements since most of us weren't even born to see, whereas in the rest of the world, you're seeing a lot of movement building happening.
Wow, that was great. Yeah. Thank you, Kim. And I think that historical context is so important. I want to back it up a little bit for our audience members who may not know some of the common terms that are thrown around and may not really understand how a youth might enter the system and how they might get stuck there. So one term that was thrown out was LWOP. And I think a lot of us do know what it is, but it's life without the possibility of parole. And in 2012, Miller versus Alabama, decision was made to make that unconstitutional. So it can no longer be a practice. However, when we think that maybe, oh, okay, now youth will not be sentenced to life without parole. But as Paul said, you know, they can get still 60 years, and that's 200 years, and just not calling it life. And so what is that? You know, what does that really look like? And so I also want to pause for a moment, too, to introduce Nate Williams, who joined us. And I'm going to give Nate an opportunity to just tell us how he's connected to the space of juvenile justice and what he thinks can really be done to help end the incarceration of our youth. And if you could grab that mic right there, yeah.
Check. Good evening.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to speak on this. First, I want to speak on this blue section. Thursday, I was in Irvine, and everybody that was at this conference was parole officers, police. It was like everything, all these boxes was there. I was the only one there, and I went there because my grant writer, she does a lot of other stuff with these people. So when I was in there, I got triggered by all these statistics and numbers and their books, their PhDs. And I told them, I stood up and said, you can't take none of this stuff to my neighborhood. You can't take none of this stuff to the real people. They're not going to respect you. They're not going to identify. You can't talk to these people. You need to have formerly incarcerated, somebody in here representing us. And the next event, they want me to present. So that was a win-win for us. Also, what you just spoke on, far as these kids are getting a lot of time. I did 32 years in prison. I was one of the first juvenile trial in the state of California. When I was sentenced, they were saying, there was a commercial that said, use a gun, go to prison. I didn't believe it. I went to prison. At 17, they tried me as an adult, right? While I was in prison, I changed my life and all this. And Michelle Alexander, she wrote this book called New Jim Crow. She was responsible for getting me home. Since home, I left people home. I left people back inside. Most of them have LWOPs, never coming home. Some of them are coming home due to me and others like me. I'll give it up for ARC, because ARC, Scott Budnick, allowed me to really learn how to be a lobbyist, learn how to go talk to politicians and tell them our stories, and not argue with them, but just tell them all the successful stories that each one of us is doing out here, and just walk away. To whereas when these politicians in state capitol turn on their TV, they're always saying, well, the news always show us in a bad light, like you go to jail, you come out, you go back in. They never show somebody like me or anybody else, you know, that's been home. Like I graduated my bachelor's degrees from CIS since home. I graduated from Stanford in a business program, started my own nonprofit, finna start a for-profit. I mean, I'm doing a lot of things, and I'm fighting for the rights of those I left behind. And these politicians are really looking at us, and really, we're changing the views. And SB 260 and SB 261, I helped change that law. And that law, I don't care if a kid gets 1,000 years. If he go inside that system, and then when you first go in, they tell you, if you don't have a GED or a high school diploma, they tell you get your GED, high school diploma, stay out of trouble. If you do that in 10 years, now I don't care if you get 1,000 years, they're going to be considered for parole. I helped do that. And other SB laws too, it feels good for people to come home and thank me for being there for them. It's not, I'm doing what I said I was going. I'm doing what we all need to be doing. And what else? What else?
What you think is the most important next step to ending juvenile incarceration?
I believe in just demolishing the whole system. I spoke with Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is a famous architect. When you think of Frank Gehry, if you picture a Google building and a golf course on top, you go like, wow, that's the type of stuff he built. They asked Frank Gehry, if you was to build a prison, what would it look like? How would it affect the community? And I spoke to each one of his students that would design these prisons. Each one of these students designed these prisons, and they didn't have no guards. Inside the prisons were counselors, case managers, doctors, regular citizens, and the prisons was right in the community. This is what I would like to see. Prisons without bars, prisons with the people, helping the people, not punishment. I'm into restorative justice. I'm into a lot of things other than locking people up. That's my solution.
That's great, and thank you for that. And I think all of our panelists have given us like a really broad scope of things that we need to consider, right? In terms of juvenile justice, we've talked about the history, knowing where we've come from in all of this, and knowing how we got here, especially with centering LA as this kind of epicenter of where it all began. We've talked about keeping people, the humanity in mind, and making sure we change people's perspectives on what needs to happen as a form of punishment. You know, we've talked a little bit about remembering the youth and centering credible messengers, right? Making sure that they're at the core of things. And so I want to also ask, so youth are incarcerated for all kinds of things. And like one of the youth I've worked with, he told me the first time he was ever arrested, he was 6 years old. He was hanging out with his cousins and his little brothers, and they asked him, because he was the smallest, he could fit through the window, right? And so he went and was put through the window to come in and unlock the door. And, you know, not more than 30 minutes later, he's in handcuffs at 6, sitting in the station. You know, what does that do to the mind of a child, right? How does that trauma continue to affect them over and over again? How does that make them feel about themselves, right? So, and Kim talked a little bit about the schools, right? You know, youth, now that we have prisons and schools, the school to prison pipeline is real, right? So policing in schools, how does that happen here in LA or in New York? What's been going on to try to change that specifically as one way that youth get into the system? Not the only, but as one way. And so I just want to open that up to anyone who wants to.
I want to speak on this because I work inside schools as well. These schools, I work in Northern California for Westside Community Services as a case manager, and I also have my own nonprofit. But when I'm in the capacity of working for Westside Community Services as a case manager, some of my clients are in these schools, and they call me when these kids are being disruptive, so they say, and I go to these schools, and they got these rooms that's the size of a closet, and when I look at them, it reminds me of a cell, and they call these rooms reboot. Like, you got to reboot this kid because this kid came to school and he has a headache, so he has his head down. He's not being disruptive, but he's not going along with what the school said he should. So they take him out of his class and they put him in these rooms, and they give him these, like, maybe 6 assignments that's really simple, and if they do it, they can return back to the class. But the kid, like, it's part of the pipelines to prison because the teachers had an attitude, and then the kid doesn't know how to really react because nobody's in there really identifying what's going on. For me, my father was an alcoholic, used to abuse my mom, and the school never asked what was going on with me as a child. Growing up till I was 8 years old, I witnessed my mother being beaten, bloody eyes, busted lips. I had to go to school, and I would always be worried about my mom. Is she okay? So I would not do my work. They would take me out of these classes, put me in these special class to test me, and I would do my work, and then they would put me back in my class, not asking what's going on at home. I had a serious problem. I had trauma going on in my house, right? And then I had went to jail for something I didn't do, right? And that's what really made me really give up and really, like, I didn't want to live. I didn't care about nobody's life, and I care about my life. You know, they tried me for something I didn't do. They tricked me, you know. And it's just been a journey to go through that, you know.
So we've always had a school-to-jail track, and we've always had tracking in the United States. This is an extension of that. But the creation of police in schools is a pretty relatively new phenomenon, like I mentioned, really starting in the 1970s. LA Unified School District still has the largest school police department in the nation, and it began in 1976. Then with Columbine and other school shootings, but really starting with Columbine, and at that time Clinton was in the White House, he took the policies of Reagan and zero tolerance policies that Secretary Bennett and Reagan had put in place and really pushed them out to extend either school resource officers or school police in schools across the country. And you started to see schools that really began to look, like we said, more and more like prisons and less like schools. So what we've been trying to challenge in LA County and then also taking it to the state level is the existence of police in schools at all. We've had a couple of successes. They've, I think, been significant, but nothing like what we want. One is that when Sandy Hook happened, Senator Boxer, also out of California, immediately put in place an emergency law, got it passed through very, very quickly, to have law enforcement officers at the front door of all schools. And the way they get law enforcement officers at the front doors of all schools, including elementary schools, was to have the National Guard back up local law enforcement. And it made it through the Senate right away, and so we wanted to block it from getting through the House of Representatives so it would become law. By Monday, Sandy Hook started on Friday. By Monday, there was police in all LA Unified schools, as an example, and that was happening all across the country. And we're talking about kindergarten students, not just middle schools and high schools where it already existed. And so there was 90 young people that came together across the country. We had calls every week. We issued a letter of the solutions that young people came up with, and as well as all their organizations signed on. That led to a big campaign to push back on Barbara Boxer and Congress, and we were able to end that initiative, to squash that initiative. Another example was here locally when there was a state ballot measure, Prop 30, that was going to give more money prioritizing low-income students, English language learners, and students who had been in foster care. Instead, we saw that across California, a lot of that money, if not the majority of that money in some districts, was going to law enforcement in schools. The very things that pushes young people out. So in that case, in LA Unified, it's something that has to be fought across the state. But at LA Unified, a number of groups came together, and we were able to reverse that and take the $13 million that had been funded to school police and return it to students. Another example was here in LA County when we started to look at ticketing. There was about 120,000 students a year, just students in and around their schools getting ticketing. The first thing we went after was truancy tickets, and us and Public Counsel and Labor Community Strategy Center were able to end truancy tickets in LA County, or in LA Unified, I'm sorry. And then we realized that that was happening throughout. There's, I think, 90 school districts in LA County alone. So we wanted to impact something larger than that. So then for Youth Justice Coalition, we started to have our students come to our school. We have a school for young people who have been pushed out. And they were being brought sometimes in handcuffs from the sheriffs, having had their TAP card and their school ID ripped up and claiming that it was fraudulent. Or people were in long lines getting late to school because they were in long lines with the sheriffs checking them for fare evasion every day. You've all seen these lines at some stations, at some bus stations, at some metro stations, and not in communities where it's wealthier and whiter. And so we asked, like, what's the number of tickets a year, and found out that 10,000 people a year were getting these fare evasion tickets from the sheriffs. And so that led to a campaign that we first did locally and then took to the state, and last year we were able to pass Senate Bill 882, which decriminalized fare evasion for all young people in the state of California. And then we also used that to push hard against the juvenile traffic court, which was issuing all these tickets, and so we were able to close the juvenile traffic court in LA County and then divert those tickets to, unfortunately, probation, but at least young people weren't getting criminal records anymore. And then probation was so inept that the tickets were building up, so last year we won an amnesty for 250,000 past tickets. And even though that seems super dry, that's the stuff that traps young people in the system. You know, sometimes 10 years. We had one young person that at age 11, she was arrested in school for getting into a verbal altercation with another student. She was brand new to middle school, age 11. And at 20, she still couldn't get her driver's license because she had this $500 ticket on her record. So it seems like small changes in terms of how people get trapped in the system, but that was really significant in terms of freeing people. And there's tons of other things I think we need to work on, but ultimately right now we're in Students Not Suspects campaign to end random searches in schools and to eventually, we hope, remove police from all schools.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The school to prison pipeline is crazy. I mean, we end up locking up kids for missing school. We have to really think about, like, what does that mean? What does it mean when we tell youth that, you know what, you can't go on a field trip without having parental consent, but you don't need parental consent to be questioned by a police officer, right? The police do not have any obligation to call your parents if you get arrested, to question you. And so you end up in this space where you tell youth that, you know, you're a youth by all these different counts, and then if they do something that you don't quite like, you end up incarcerating them as if they're adults. So one thing I want to ask is, you know, in terms of being the mother of someone that isn't currently incarcerated, Leandra, and how has that impacted you? And, you know, what have you seen that you just, like, if you could tell other parents, you know, what would you want to tell them about the system that they should know if their son or daughter gets incarcerated?
Yeah, for me, it has impacted me tremendously just to watch my child be used by the justice system. Going in as a simple, going in like he stole a pair of shorts, okay? He goes to the police station. They call me and tell me they picked my son up. So I arrive at the police department, and I'm honestly just there for like 2 to 3 hours waiting for them to have me come in. Within those 2 to 3 hours, they're questioning him and another boy that's with him, and they end up roughhousing the one boy who was older than him, and next thing you know, they're in juvenile hall.
And how
That's
old
at
is he?
14. Okay. go to juvenile hall. He gets 30 days, come back home. He violated probation, okay? It's his birthday week, right? He needs to go, you know, celebrate his birthday. And so he comes, he's gone. Probation officer's looking for him. He's nowhere to be found. So he ends up turning himself in. He does 45 days. The third time he goes in, it's over a skateboard. Him and this boy's in the skate park. The one friend that was with him gets in another altercation with the other kid over mom. They're talking about, you're talking about my mom, you know, type of thing. You know, if you don't stop talking about my mom, then I'm gonna punch you or whatever. So the kid keeps talking about the mother, and so the friend of my son hits him. So the other kid takes his skateboard, he hits the other guy, the other boy, and you know, next thing you know, he's taking the skateboard, and so those two children, my son and his friend, gets picked up for strong arm robbery, and my son had nothing to do with it because he was, you know, with him. He's on probation, so he got charged the same as this other kid. They kept my son for 5 months because he's been in juvie for 3 years, 3 times. So the 3 times that he was in there, they're trying to figure out, okay, what we're going to do with this kid since it's his 3rd time in here. And so then now they decide they want to do a fitness hearing. Are we going to keep him in juvie, or are we going to put him in adult court, charge him as adult? They take him to, he gets his, has his, you know, his fitness hearing, and the judge finds him fit on 2 counts of juvie and 3 counts of adult. And so now he's going to adult court over a skateboard at 15. So the DA is promising this kid, if he pleads guilty to this, he can go home that day. And I'm begging him not to do that, because now you're talking about a felony. And so if you plead guilty to that, and when you turn 18, you're not going to be able to get a job or anything. He's not, you know, he's already, you know, not listening to me. They know that, okay? So they're promising this kid. He decides he's going to make a plea deal. He makes the plea deal, and so now he's, you know, he's got a felony. Yeah. So it's really sad because these children should not be charged as adult, not at that age, because between the age 14, 15, and 16, those are crucial age for those children.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to make mature decisions, you know. Obviously he didn't, you know. So it's not easy,
Right.
you know, to sit there and watch them do the things they've done to my child.
Right.
You know, just prepare him for juvie. Now they're preparing him for prison, and that's what they're doing to the youth today.
Can I speak on that?
Yeah, go ahead and speak on it, and then we'll take a question.
I want to speak for my mom, because I know I put my mom through hell. And my mother was always able to come get me out of jail every time I broken the law or whatever. And my last, when I went through my fitness hearing, I was tried as an adult, I remember my mom coming, they let us have a visit, and there was no glass, it was like a plexiglass about this high. And we was talking in juvenile hall, and she kept saying, she started saying, "Why did you do this?" I'm like, "Do what?" And she said, she just started crying. And I knew everything I had did from since I was 8 till that moment at 17 years old. You know, I had police coming to the house looking for me, pulling guns to her head, my sister, a lot of stuff. and she said, Mama's not going to be able to take you home. Mama's not going to be able to even go see you because they're going to send you way up in Northern California. And, you know, all that time in prison, I did 32 years in prison. The time didn't bother me. It was those words when I was 17 of hurting my mother and see her cry like that. But on the flip side of the day, it's the opposite because I'm out here doing a lot of good things, and every time I do something, she's there, she'll be here in a minute, and it feels good to be able to do that. But prior to that, my mother, she shut down. When I was sentenced to 25 years of life, she shut down. She blamed herself for my actions. And I said, no, it's not you. I made those decisions to break the law, whatever I did. You know, and it's like now I'm part of this reentry program up in San Francisco. We made this guide for people coming home. I'm featured in the first of the book. So if you come to our house, my mom is going to give you the book. See, this is my son right here. Anything I do, my graduation bachelor degree, here, this is my son right here. And that feels good. But prior to that, I hurt my mom. And I know that's what she went through.
I just want to add something else to you know, what, which probably with you been through and what my son had gone through. I want to say that I don't think I ever really blamed myself. I knew right off the bat that he was emotional. He was going through something. He just didn't know how to express himself. A lot of times these children are like that. They don't know how to express themselves, so they get into things, they do things. They don't really know what they're doing, you know. So, but I want to say that for my son, for the things that they got him for, and the charges that they added on, because you know they trump up charges, right? Once they get you in there, they trump all these charges, and then next thing you know, they got all these charges on this kid, and eventually they're going to make a plea deal because they don't want to be in there. You know, they don't want to be locked up. So they're going to make a plea deal, and then, you know, there go their life, you know. So we have to do whatever we have to do to make changes, to make sure that our youth understand a lot about what's going on as far as being incarcerated and as far as what they're doing to these children and what they're telling these children to get them to, you know, make these deals and all that other stuff. It's deep. It's deep.
I'm going to add to that. They will come at you. They came at me. I was a juvenile. Detectives came at me with cigarettes. I'm not supposed to be smoking, coffee, and just back to back to whereas I'm, like you said, they're gonna let you go home, right? If you tell what's going on or whatever you do. And I wouldn't. But they use those type of things. 90% of everybody in prison or juvenile hall, they force them to take these plea bargains. 90%.